All right, it is my distinct pleasure today to introduce Tim Hedley. Tim is past chairman of the Connecticut Society of CPAs, and he's also the founding chair of the ESG committee. He is currently executive in residence at Fordham University's Gabelli School of Business. He's responsible for the school's ESG literacy programs, and he teaches other courses such as sustainability reporting, business risks in a digital and global economy, and forensic accounting. Tim is retired partner from KPMG, where he served as the global lead partner for fraud risk management services. Again, my distinct pleasure. Tim, welcome to the session, and we appreciate your time.
Well, thank you, Cindy. And thank you all for joining us. Cindy, actually, if any interesting questions came up during the session, I don't have a problem actually answering them.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, if it's something that looks interesting. If it's particularly difficult, never mind. But if it looks interesting in a softball, I have no problem doing it. That was my intro slide here, but pretty much Cindy said all the important stuff that means something here. But I do have the distinct pleasure of having been very involved with Connecticut Society CPA. I am actually the immediate past chair. So it was a great year last year where I did serve as your chair. Now we have as an update on ESG. I think it was a couple of years ago, Cindy, I actually did a whole program on a CPE session on ESG, where I did an introduction to how to integrate into your business and what have you. I don't know if that recording is still available or not, Cindy.
Oh, I'll have to check with Lisa.
Yeah, because we can also make that available as a precursor to this. Also, I had the opportunity to write an article for the Connecticut CPA about integrating ESG into your business and what ESG means and those kinds of things. So I'm sure you can get your hands on that as well. So again, this is just an update on the kinds of things that are happening in ESG and sustainability. But some of you probably didn't attend those other sessions or read the article or anything else, or may not have any idea whatsoever about what ESG and sustainability are. So I'm going to talk a few minutes about that. The lexicon of ESG, okay? It is a framework to mitigate environmental, social, and governance risks and opportunities into a company's strategy to build long-term financial stability and value creation. As far as I'm concerned, ESG, sustainability are all about long-term value creation. And I'll talk about that in some detail in a minute. On the right-hand side, at the top of the slide, there's a definition that came out in 1987 in a UN report. Sustainability is the ability of a company to exist constantly meeting the needs of today without compromising future generations. The idea is that we don't mortgage our future. We don't mortgage our future. And for ESG, in sustainability, corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility, triple bottom line, all those things are pretty much used interchangeably. Okay, so people say, what's the difference between sustainability and ESG? Well, maybe there's a subtle difference, maybe not. I don't think there's a difference. I think they're all interchangeable. I do know that the SASB FSA 1 guide said they're exactly the same thing. And in other spots that the UN has written about, they're pretty much the same thing. But again, impact, all these kinds of things mean pretty much the same thing. The E, environmental, how a business performs as steward of our natural environment, includes things like greenhouse gas emissions, which we'll talk about more later on, energy consumption, energy efficiency, natural resource depletion, waste and pollution, deforestation, hazardous materials, all those kinds of things. I have to say, in our current environment, when we're talking about sustainability and ESG, it pretty much is client first. And a lot of the legislation, acts, and things that the government, state government, federal government's been doing are all essentially driven toward climate and the environment. Social, it's highly politicized. I'm sorry, moved back too fast. Social is how business treats its people and the communities in which it lives. Okay, and includes things like water safety, employee diversity, equality, opportunities, equal opportunities, I should say, employee retention, the supply chain, human rights, labor standards, child labor, all of these kinds of things. Customer satisfaction, product safety, community relations are all part of the social agenda. Governance is how a company polices itself. It's all about all of its policing activities. Okay. Executive pay and demographics, risk management processes, compliance with accounting standards, all the policies, programs, and controls the company puts into place. That's what governance is about. Now, I said the agenda is climate first. Personally, I believe it's governance first. I can't get any of this stuff right unless I have the policies, programs, and controls to get it right. Okay. But it's become a very highly politicized space. And I'm going to tackle that issue first and see if I can talk through it a little bit and probably what it means. Because the number one thing people tell me about this space, it's a fad. All the things they read in the paper about the pushback in ESG. There is a lot of pushback on parts of the agenda. And we'll try to tackle a little bit, but I think that's part and parcel to the update. Okay. When I first started lecturing on this stuff, I used to talk about a paradigm shift in thinking. Well, now it's a shifting paradigm because it's shifted one way, it's shifted another way, it's finding a spot in the middle, but overall, it's still trying to find itself. And I'm going to go back to the 70s and Milton Friedman. Okay, Milton Friedman has a Nobel Prize in economics. Obviously, a lot of people were great followers of his. I know when I was in school and going to grad school and stuff, it was all about Milton Friedman type thinking. And he said there is one and only one social responsibility of business to use its resources, engage in activities designed to increase its profits. Use its resources to increase its profits. And that was the only social responsibility of a business. And there are certain people, like this man here, Jack Welch, was a real disciple of that thinking. Okay. Obviously considered one of the greatest managers of the 20th century, wrote best-selling books on the topic. But he came in to GE in the 1980s and, took this stuff to heart. All about, maximizing profit. I think in his first 2 years and his role, he fired 72,000 people. He closed dozens of factories. He instituted the vitality curve. That's where you essentially rank all your people, and the bottom 10% of whoever's working for you are gone. It was called the vitality curve. Enron had something similar called rank and yank. Okay, but that's where he got the name Neutron Jack. It was a high radiation nuclear weapon. Its destructive power was not necessarily to knock down buildings, but the radiation killed people, the building stood. So we inherited that moniker Neutron Jack. And by the way, he didn't like it, but nonetheless, he was kind of following the formula. We're going to maximize our profits, and that was our social responsibility. Okay, but there's been backlash against that. An interesting book came out in the last couple of years, The Man Who Broke Capitalism. Okay, so some people are arguing that probably wasn't the best way of going about this. And Jack Welch had a lot of his own disciples as well. Some were more successful than others. But over time, there's some pushback against that model. In 1999, Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, the largest money management firm in the world, they think they have over 10 trillion in assets under management. He wrote a letter to the CEOs of the companies in which they make investments. And he said, we have long believed that our clients, shareholders in your company, will benefit if you can create enduring, sustainable value for all your stakeholders. Jack Welch and Milton Friedman only had one stakeholder, and that was the shareholder. But now Larry Fink comes out, and this is famously called the letter, and said, you know what? There's more stakeholders than shareholders. We have to think about the value created for all of these others. Okay, but there's been huge pushback against this. I think Florida took out of BlackRock some $2 billion in assets under management had. Some of the states have done the same thing. So those asset managers that use ESG metrics and measures for valuation purposes, what have you. And and even more recently, companies like Tractor Supply slash its DEI, which we talked about a minute ago, your diversity programs and climate goals. After it was a right-wing pressure campaign for them to do this, Ford has backtracked on some of that social part of their program as well. John Deere has, Lowe's has, Target, much more recently, cut back on its LBGTQ plus apparel in anticipation of Pride Month and what have you, because of a lot of pressure and a lot of people upset about it. So that's kind of where so I had this paradigm shift that went from Milton Friedman to Larry Fink, thinking about a broader set of stakeholders. Now there's been a lot of pushback on parts of the agenda. Also, there are parts of the agenda that are pushed back too in climate. Because Tractor Supply wasn't just their DEI efforts, it was also their climate goals that they decided to push back on. States that have a lot of extractive industries are not thrilled with the notion of ESG and sustainability. So pendulum swung one way, now it seems to be swinging back the other way. Larry Fink himself, in a much more recent letter to the CEOs, talked about the power of capitalism. In today's globally interconnected world, a company must create value for and be valued by its full range of stakeholders. And if they stakeholders again, in order to deliver long-term value for its shareholders. So here we are, that long-term value creation for shareholders. Before, it was just mostly discussion about stakeholders. Okay. You said I don't have to hit the attendance verifications about
Correct.
yeah, okay, good, because they keep popping a tad distracting, but that's okay. Okay. Anyway, so deliver long-term value for its shareholders. So now we're pushing the pendulum, so to speak. The paradigm is moving in a different direction. It is through effective stakeholder capitalism. Now it's interesting. He uses the term stakeholder capitalism, but even that has gotten pushback. That statement, whatever the statement means to whoever reads it. As efficiently allocated companies achieve durable profitability, got to be profitable, and value is created and sustained over the long term. What is missing sometimes when people talk about the ESG sustainability agenda, I think it's about the do-good type of stuff, and at the sacrifice of corporate profits and what have you. That's not what it is. Any company to be sustainable must generate cash flows from operations, which is going to come from the revenues. At a minimum, be sustainable. But the ESG perspective, sustainability perspective, is more about long-term value creation and a bit less about short-termism. Okay, and there are other places where this has manifested itself. And I think one of the best is Procter & Gamble. Okay, they have their purpose. Whenever you pick up a sustainability report of a company, they'll have their purpose, what their vision is of their own company. And they wrote in their sustainability report, our purpose will provide branded products and services of superior quality. Okay, that's a good purpose. And value that improve the lives of the world's consumers, now and for generations to come. As a result, consumers will reward us with leadership, sales, profit, and again, the term value creation, allowing our people, our shareholders, and the communities. And the communities are those stakeholders in which we live, and to prosper. So it's all good stuff. It's all good stuff. But again, you can see how it's not just focused on the notion, hey, we're going to do all these wonderful good things at the risk of our profits and all those kinds of things. No, it's not about that anymore. I think a lot of companies have clued into this. We have to make sure we're giving the tip of the hat and thinking about what this is actually going to mean in the long term to our shareholders. At the same time, be cognizant of the communities in which we live. So I wanted to talk about that first because I get so much pushback from people about what this actually means and everything they read about it, and companies like Tractor Supply and Ford and Lowe's and cutting back parts of their agenda. They're doing it. There's a lot of political pressure out there in some communities that do these kinds of things. But again, at the same time, most companies are taking this very, very seriously. A recent survey I saw from leading CEOs, I think, oh gosh, the number was, a vast majority of them have instituted sustainability ESG type measures. Okay. But again, because of this thing, the notion that ESG become a dirty word, a lot of companies have now stopped calling their ESG reports ESG reports. Like Pfizer, for example, I believe now calls it an impact report, but they're doing the same exact stuff they were doing before. And on the S&P 500, I think 98% of companies issue a sustainability report. So it's here, it's not going anywhere. In a minute, you're going to see why I believe it's not going anywhere. So I'm going to talk about our sustainability developments, or ESG developments, or impact developments, whatever you want to call it, mostly focused in 2024. I could go back further in history. I can go back, I can go back further in the past or into the future, but I'm pretty much stuck to what's going on in 2024. And some of the legislation that's pending, some of the rules making by the federal government, and what have you, to say, hey, you know what? There's a lot moving here. And why do you need to know there's a lot moving here? First of all, I want you to know that this is not going away, so you have to pay attention to it. But as accountants, we have a role to play. Okay. I believe we have a role to play as trusted advisors in this space. We helped a lot of companies move through Sarbanes-Oxley. This is a similar daunting task of collecting the information that's necessary and all that kind of stuff. We're very, very good at that. We're also amazingly good at data collection to put together these sustainable reports that are necessary. And a big play for us is going to be in the attestation space. Currently, very little you find in a sustainability report has attestation attached to it, but that's a growing area. And it's going to be doubly important to accountants and to auditors, because we're not going to have the same mandate to be the ones to provide attestation in this space as we do for things like the 10K. Okay, you have to be a CPA, those kinds of things. We are just with our skills, we're well positioned to do this stuff, and it's our best interest to earn the right to do it. And I think we have that opportunity. I could do a whole session just on that one role as well. So let me talk about some of the developments. And the first one's one I'm going to talk about is, I'm sure, one you've been hearing about. And that's the SEC's final climate rule on climate. At the moment, this has been voluntarily stayed by the SEC. But in the bottom line, it's going to require large publicly traded companies to disclose climate action, greenhouse gas emissions, and financial impacts of severe weather events. This stuff is going to be in the notes of the financial statements, my understanding. Okay, this stuff, there's going to have some level of attestation around it. Okay, we're not going to get away from it here. Right now, we don't have to. They're not doing it. It is stayed, but it won't be permanent. The SEC is pushing hard for it. Many believe that these climate risks and greenhouse gas emissions have long-term economic consequences to companies, and we have to start disclosing what those risks are and what it's going to take to mitigate those risks and what those impacts are. All those kinds of things, we're going to have to be discussing it. Okay, and I don't think we're going to get away from it. And a little bit later, I'll talk about another reason we're not going to get away from this in the US, despite the pushback and the politicization of it. There is going to be other reasons for a lot of companies in the US to actually do this stuff. I do want to make a mention. It says must disclose material, scope 1 and or scope 2 emissions. There's also a scope 3 emissions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but at least I want you to be able to come to terms somewhat with what in the world those mean. Okay, so I do have a slide. It's kind of a classic. I hope it shows up well on your screen, because it doesn't look good on my screen right now. Okay, but scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions, and those are all the greenhouse gases on top. And actually, in my one class in the semester in Fordham, I actually lecture an entire class just on greenhouse gas accounting. But company facilities, company vehicles, these are the direct scope 1 types of emissions. Okay, that's going to have to be disclosed. The others are the scope 2 indirect emissions, and you can see where they purchase their energy from. Okay, that would be the scope 2. Okay, what's not included here, but is included elsewhere in other legislation, is scope 3 emissions. SEC doesn't have it, but other things we'll talk about in the future do have it. Scope 3, combined with scope 1 and 2, is your entire value chain. And obviously, you look down, the transportation, distribution, your goods and services, and the use of these things, and disposal of things you produce, and how your people actually commute to work, all these kinds of things are going to have to be measured in certain circumstances. So those are scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And they contribute to all those greenhouse gases that are at the top. Okay, so that's the SEC's a pending rule. The rule came out, and I really believe this is going to move forward. Will it make a difference who wins in November? I think the Republicans are not as favorably disposed to this as are the Democrats. But we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. Okay, National Action Plan on Responsible Business Conduct. Okay, this is National Action Plan. The government came out, and this does not require or create any new legal obligations on the parts of company. But what they're doing is saying, this is our expectation for responsible business conduct. Okay, it supports investors to conduct human rights due diligence, specifically in companies whose technology promotes human rights abuses. So if you're Hershey's and you're sourcing the cacao bean from wherever in the world you're sourcing it, and it's really not in Connecticut, well, you have to think about, what child labor, human rights abuses, all these kinds of things. You have to think about this. You have a responsibility to conduct the right type of due diligence. Why I put this in here, even though it does not have currently any sort of creating any new legal obligations, I think directionally it tells you where the federal government's going to be going. Okay, so I think that there, we look at this and we say, oh, it doesn't say I have to do something, but you know what? This is going to be probably an expectation. There'll probably be rules around this in the future, things that we're going to really have to pay attention to. That's why I added this one in here. But again, all of this is really all about the S part of ESG, all about the S part. What we just saw a minute ago, so before, it's kind of climate first. Well, that was all greenhouse gas emissions, okay? And what's going on with the climate. This is part of the social part of it. Okay, California had a landmark plastic pollution law focusing on single-use plastics. They're saying, hey, by 2032, California aims to reduce single-use plastic by 25%, increase recycling to 65%. Now, this is important, okay? This is really important. This is actually a continuation of a lot of efforts they've had underway for quite a while. I believe only 9% of plastic is actually recycled, only 9%. So if you're diligent and you're trying to throw all your recycling in the bin, and you look at the container and it's got a 1, a 2 on it, stuff you threw in there, the chances of that stuff actually being recycled is minimal, okay? And a lot of companies take advantage of the labeling of their materials to make it look like it's more sustainable or greener or somehow better than what other plastic. That's actually known as greenwashing. Okay, but they're going to make a real concerted effort here to do something about this. Okay, so another one came out. This is the rule to maximize federal purchases of American-made sustainable products and services. Okay, sustainable products and services. The rule influences the federal government's purchasing power to advance American manufacturing and reach sustainable supply chains. Okay. The idea is to encourage a market for environmentally friendly products, create jobs in the country, create economic benefits while advancing administration's environmental goals by instructing federal agencies to prioritize the purchase of sustainable products and services. Why is this particularly important in our case? Well, it's particularly important in our case because the largest purchaser in the world is the U.S. federal government. So if the U.S. federal government is taking this direction, it can have a large impact. It can also influence what a lot of other states do and what have you. But we are the world's largest purchasers of stuff. And I actually did not realize, I had a feeling that may have been true, but until this rule came out, I started looking at it and paying attention to it, then I realized, wow, we buy as a country, we buy a lot of stuff, plain and simple. So this might make a difference. Again, this is toward the environmental portion of the ESG agenda. Okay, this is the U.S. The American Privacy Rights Act. Okay, this, if it goes into effect, will be would apply broadly. We impose restrictions on the use of sensitive covered data, and would have multiple means of enforcement. Okay, multiple means of enforcement, including private right of action. Okay, so it wouldn't have to just be the government bringing a course of action, and private citizens and companies could do it themselves. Okay, and it's also designed, goes into effect to preempt state law. Okay, now this is back to the social agenda. This is back to the social agenda because this notion of protecting consumer privacy rights and all those kinds of things, part and parcel to the social agenda. This is an interesting act. Almost the rest of the developed world already has these kinds of things in place. And we're maybe the only, but one of the few countries in the world that does not have a comprehensive rule like this to regulate this consumer data privacy. Personally, I think it is way overdue to make sure that your privacy rights data privacy rights are protected. Obviously, California is well known to have something like this in place, but again, this would preempt all state laws and be the first, national attempt at this. And again, we're a real latecomer to this world. We can speculate on why that might be. Big technology companies probably would be thrilled with this, and they have a lot of influence in the Capitol Hill and what have you. But nonetheless, this is where it's going in the U.S. Okay, so California. Okay, now this says they moved to delay the corporate climate reporting requirements until 2028. It was supposed to take effect in 2026, but essentially what's going to happen in California, all large publicly traded companies are going to have to disclose greenhouse gas emissions and the financial impacts of severe weather events. Okay, severe weather events. This is not really dissimilar, but it's a little more expansive than what has actually taken place or will take place at the federal level. Okay, but again, companies doing business in California, a large company, I think it's more than $500 million in business, or they do $1 billion in revenue, we should say. They're going to have to adhere to this stuff and actually write a report that talks about their climate action, what's going on. And there are, I think, 3 separate laws that actually affect this particular pieces of legislation. Okay, but they did put it off a little bit. And my understanding is they put it off. There's still more discussion to do around to get the rules right, and also it takes time to implement these kinds of things. You have to learn how do you report these things? How do you collect the data? All those kinds of things. So that's why I think this one got pushed off a little bit. Okay, another Packaging Product Stewardship Act. I think New Jersey is probably one of, oh God, it's got to be, I don't know, 14 or more different states that are actually doing a lot with respect to packaging products. And what they're trying to do is reduce plastic waste in the state of New Jersey. It's a big, complicated bill. I haven't read it thoroughly though, but I've looked at it and said, wow, this is kind of complicated. But what they said, at least the New Jersey government said, they're awash in plastic. They're awash in plastic, and they got to do something about it. And it mandates that packaging producers create and execute packaging product stewardship plans that include various elements. identification of the producers involved and the packaging products included in the plan, objectives for waste reduction, methods for decreasing total production, strategies for recycling and reusing discarded packaging products, to incorporate a minimum amount of recycled content in new packaging. Remember, I told you only 9% of plastic is actually recycled, and meet designated recycling rate targets. Explain how feedback from stakeholders will integrate into the plan. So it's pretty darn comprehensive. But one of the points they made when they're putting this together, it turns out the producers of packaging materials have used lower and lower quality plastics. And a lot of those plastics truly aren't really recyclable at all. And the idea is you gotta, whatever you're gonna be doing now, you gotta be more recyclable than it was in the past. And you have to help make sure that, you know, people can actually do this stuff. Again, another big environmental act that's pending now. It will go into effect. There is a big plastics problem all over the world, all over the country and all over the world. And certainly New Jersey has recognized that they see this as a serious issue. Okay, have we got any questions, Cindy?
No, we do not yet.
Okay, you can feel free to ask me if you want. Okay, New York State to amend the financial services law, requiring corporations to prepare an annual climate-related financial risk report. Okay, these are financial services law. Okay, it's a financial services company for companies in the state with annual revenues exceeding 500 million in the previous year, under the oversight of the Department of Financial Services, are now mandated by the Act to prepare a publicly disclose an annual climate-related financial risk report. The outcome of this is actually a little bit uncertain. I'm not sure exactly where it's going to go. It is a bit uncertain. Been a lot of pushback on it. It is very similar, but slightly more constrained than what California is actually more successfully moving forward with. So we'll see how this works out. I have a feeling, though, that it will eventually pass. Again, there's some in the state. I don't think there's more of a political divide in the state of New York, this is my experience, than there is in the state of California. So I'm not certain where this is going to go, but it's out there, it's waiting. I think eventually it will go, even if it's watered down a little bit. Okay, this one is, I think, quite a bit ahead of its time in some sense. This is California's first of its kind comprehensive AI Act. And what it's pretty much saying, when AI makes, or is a factor in making, a consequential decision, okay? And generally speaking, consequential decisions involve things like education, employment, financial services, housing, healthcare, legal services. Anything that's consequential, well, there are going to be stringent requirements for developers and users of high-risk systems and mandates reporting any violations to the Attorney General's office. Okay, notifications for consumers of high-risk AI systems and inform users that these systems are making significant decisions affecting them. Developers and deployers are required to inform consumers how AI was used in significant decisions, including details of the type of data processed and source. This applies to AI developers and deployers operating in Colorado. So I think this is interesting, and I think you're going to see a lot more of this coming out. But more and more, actually, for a long time, AI has been at the heart of a lot of decision-making processes. A lot of expert systems, what have you, are essentially AI systems. So they've been around a lot longer than we think. It's this generative AI kind of stuff and the push and the new stuff that's coming out that's getting all the attention. But actually, a lot of very consequential decisions have been made by machines for quite some time. The first paper I ever wrote as an academic was published in 1991 in an expert systems journal, and it was about how to account for certain transactions in business, and the machine told you how to do it. So we've been doing this a lot longer than we think we've been doing it, but it's these new systems that are coming out and the power of them, what have you, it's actually pushing this agenda. I think this kind of thing is way overdue. But again, we'll see how it actually pans out. Okay. Now, one from the European Union. And the others are all kind of US driven. They're all very, very recent things. You can get a sense that the agenda is alive and well. The ESG agenda is alive and well and moving forward. But at least in the US, and when I've lectured to different groups, I lectured to the Indonesian Wealth Management Association when they're in New York several months ago, and a group from Galway, I think 2 months ago. I'm talking about this stuff and talking about what's happened in the US, and I talk about the politicization of this in the US. They're actually all shocked. They can't believe, and they never heard, in the EU, they don't understand it, even in Indonesia. Everybody's doing this stuff. They see it's important. And I say here in the US, we get a lot of pushback. So, but even with that having been said, a lot going on there. But there's one here that's happening in the European Union I want to talk about, because this is going to affect a lot of US companies. Okay. And this went into effect at the beginning of the year. And it actually replaced another directive they had, the non-financial reporting directive. Okay. And this is the corporate sustainability reporting directive. Okay. So this is going to require a whole lot more reporting on the part of EU countries. Okay. Expands required sustainable reporting, affecting about 50,000 EU and 10,000 non-EU companies. So what looked like only a few companies actually reporting on this stuff, certainly we see in the US, you don't see, there's not 50,000 companies reporting this stuff. But now in the EU, boy, it's just like everybody's got to report. And it requires companies to report sustainability information based on the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, developed by something known as the EFRAG. So they've got their own reporting standards in Europe. And they were developed as a group called the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group. And you're going to have to report using this standard. You're going to have a little report using those standards. The directive mandates a double materiality approach. Now, double materiality is probably a concept many of you aren't familiar with. We're all familiar as accountants, CPAs, with traditional financial materiality. Traditional financial materiality. In the ESG sustainability space, there is something known as impact materiality. So when I think about traditional materiality, financial materiality, I'm talking about investor-focused materiality or providers of capital-focused materiality. The kinds of things, at least when I was doing all those audits, what is materiality? What does it mean? We all have a really good sense of that. But now you have to start thinking about something called impact materiality. And impact materiality means how you impact not just the shareholders or the provider of capital, but how you impact everybody else. What effect do your externalities have on the communities in which you live? Okay, and externality is every time there's where you're doing business, there is some sort of effect caused by that business. Okay, burning coal. Obviously, a lot of particulates in the air, what have you, but mining the coal itself does a lot of environmental damage. Those kinds of things are not are externalities. Usually, negative externalities, the cost of the externality, what it really, the harm it causes, or what it takes to clean up, and those kinds of things, is never included in the price of the service. Because if we are generating electricity from coal, pollutants go into the air and the damage to the environment, no one's really picking up those kinds of costs. But now, with this notion of impact materiality, how others are affected has to be measured. Okay, a lot of times it's very, very qualitative, but nonetheless, it's all built in to these reporting standards and other frameworks that are used as well, that I can report both impact materiality, traditional materiality, and they're both together, they're called double materiality. One last type of materiality to think about is something called dynamic materiality. And our traditional materiality doesn't, what it really means to us doesn't change. But all the kinds of things that are material from an impact materiality standpoint can change significantly from a period to period, quarter to quarter, they change. So you got a whole bunch of different moving parts here than we're used to in our financial reporting space. Also in our financial reporting space, we have an annual report. It's Form 10K. It's driven by Regulation SX and Regulation SK. When you pick up a sustainability report in any U.S. company, there is no form. There are no regulations to say how this stuff works. But this is the direction we're moving in. So, double materiality approach to identify material impacts, risks, and opportunities. Directive aims to enhance accountability and transparency globally, setting new standards for sustainability governance and reporting practices. Okay, so we're in the double materiality, impact materiality, traditional materiality. Think about dynamic materiality. We got these frameworks or standards we have to adhere to get all of this done. Why am I talking about it here? Well, see where it says 10,000 non-EU companies? Well, there's a delayed phase-in for this, but any U.S. company with significant operations in the EU are going to have to comply. They're going to have to comply. So if you're a company like PepsiCo, in a couple of years, you're going to have to comply, whether you like it or not. Now, we don't have necessarily the European sustainability reporting standards. Here we'd use, probably we're using SASB now and TCFD and GRI. There will be interoperability where we will be able to comply with what's going on in the EU. But again, that's what's coming. U.S. companies are going to have to do it, and it'll be phased in. Also, what's important for our perspective, this stuff will have to be attested to. Okay, and they have a phased-in approach. No attestation, no limited attestation, and then reasonable attestation several years out. So again, another big potential play for us in helping develop these reports, understanding what's out there, talking to our clients about it, and then have the potential to provide an awful lot of additional services. Okay, so that's the EU Corporate Reporting, Sustainable Reporting Directive. It's top of mind for many U.S. companies, figuring out how they're going to actually comply with all this stuff. And that's one of the reasons a lot of companies now are already producing impact reports, sustainability reports, whatever they happen to call it, already doing this because you know what? This train has left the station. Okay, so as far as we want to think we're putting behind us, there's going to be a fad or whatever. Now, the stuff's out here, and we're going to have to deal with it. There's an awful lot of similar legislation all over the world. Okay, I could have done a whole lot more, and a whole nother, I don't know much more time on the EU alone, talking about what they've got going on. But you go wherever it is in Asia, South America, Africa, what have you. Believe it or not, a lot of these countries and regions are actually much further ahead than the U.S. is in this space. But again, doing business in these places, you're going to have to wind up complying. Now, what is really interesting, though, is there's a lot of innovation that's taking place. Okay, it's not just about, hey, here's all the things you have to do. You don't have any choice about these things. There's standards or mandates or all these kinds of things, but there's a lot of opportunity for innovation. New things being developed that are actually trying to help push the agenda forward. And there's one I've been involved with that I'm going to share with you. Okay, and it's called natural asset companies. You say, wow, what's a natural asset company? Well, there's a group called the Intrinsic Exchange Group, and they have developed an ecological performance framework, okay, based on standards developed. It's a system of environmental economic accounting, ecology accounting, that's what that stands for, that can accurately, transparently, and consistently provide investors the information needed to value natural asset companies and the underlying natural assets they manage. So you're saying, what does that mean? I mean, what are natural assets? Well, they assign value to services that can be provided by nature. For example, storing carbon in a forest, rather than the extraction of, or instead of logging, I don't log. It's a great carbon storage, and I can sell the carbon credits and do things like that. It will have a lot of value to it. And these NACs will hold all of these ecosystem service rights, or at least the benefits. They'll also have things like food, pollination, tourism, clean water, all of these kinds of things that where natural assets bring value, and they can be monetized. They can actually monetize. They believe that the value globally is about $125 trillion. Now, this is brand new, and the first NAC is coming out as we speak. So they've developed this really interesting framework that says, this is how you value these kinds of things. An awful lot of work went into develop them. They were talking to the SEC about actually listing NACs on the New York Stock Exchange. They're still working on that thing. The first one coming out is a private placement for this particular company. Some of the European exchanges are very interested in publicly trading natural asset companies. Again, it's kind of a really cool innovation that is really trying to, improve the environment, improve the ecology. At the same time, there's a huge financial play in this. But again, it's all about sustainable natural assets, not things that you can't go mining, you can't cut down all the wood, you can't do all those things. It's got to be things like if you had a piece of land, fallow piece of land, wasn't creating anything, and you redeveloped it, where you grew trees on all those kinds of things, or somehow made it into wetlands and things like that. That stuff has real value. So this is just an example of the kind of innovations that are coming out. I've been working with them now for, I think since almost a year on the framework itself, and a lot of questions they had, because they're mostly economists, like, you know what, we're going to have this report that comes out. These are going to be publicly traded, and that report itself has to have attestation attached to it. So I've been working with them about, how are you going to get attestation of that? And a lot of firms are really interested in saying, hey, here's an area for services that we can provide. We're just trying to figure out how we're going to get there. Again, these are brand new. No one's ever done them before, so it takes a lot of work. I think I've gone pretty close to my 15 minutes, Cindy. Or is she still there?
Oh, sorry about that. I wasn't hitting my mute quick enough.
Or am I a minute short of my 50? I'm a minute short of my 15 minutes. But I guess if we have any Q&A, more than happy to take any not difficult questions.
We do have Q&A for you, Tim. The first one is, when does the American privacy law go into effect?
The American privacy law, it's in committee right now, I believe. So I don't know.
Okay. And then it says, where do you think politicization of ESG is headed?
That's a very good question. It's going to depend on who gets in office. A lot of it, I think. I have read the Project 2025 report. By the way, it's a long thing to read. A lot of what we talked about here does not fit that agenda. Now, does that go into effect? I don't know. So there are a lot of things, but the politicization, I can't answer it. If we were anything like what's happened overseas, everybody I've talked to, and there's been many groups I've talked to, they just don't see it. I was at the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation for their ISSB. I met with those people last month, And like they're listening to me talk and what they're hearing about in the US and politicization doesn't make any sense to them. The Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales, chatted with them too last month when I was in London. They don't see it either. So I think politicization here could get a whole lot worse. But I still think the agenda is going to have to move forward, because I've given you some examples of we're going to really have to, the companies are going to actually really have to do this, plain and simple. So I don't have a perfect answer for that. But if you look at Project 2025 and you read it, and they're not really funding a lot of this stuff. So we'll see where it goes.
As you mentioned earlier, Tim, there's been a real division between most Republicans and Democrats at the state legislative level when it comes to ESG components. And I was just curious, with everything happening in California, which is where a lot of this stuff originates, oftentimes in our state, in our country. Do you expect that to slowly work its way east, or to jump coasts and work its way towards the middle? So oftentimes Connecticut looks at things that California has. Sometimes New York does, sometimes New Jersey has. Has there been any rumbling on the East Coast regarding starting to push forward state initiatives on ESG?
Yeah, in the deck, I did have something from New York State. And what they're doing, they're pushing a climate action that's very similar to what California is doing. I think it's going to jump coast, because they're going back to the politicization of it. It's more the blue states need to be more receptive. I don't want to get too political here, but seem more receptive to this. Remember, a lot of the red states, in particularly states that are highly dependent upon extractive industries, don't like this at all. Okay, they push back hard against a lot of this stuff. The NACs, when the SEC had their comment period, it was the middle part of America that had some issues with it. The coast really thought this was a good idea, but I think the middle part of the country is going to have to go along with this, whether they want to or not. But I think a lot of the impetus, at least at the state levels, are going to be on the coast.
You covered a lot of what was happening in California and indicated that people that are doing business there. How broadly is the state of California interpreting that doing business there?
I think you had to do over $1 billion of revenue.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, that's what I believe the mandate. Again, they push it off. What's hard in this space, when things are they come out with the rules or whatever, and they're rethinking them, then they change them on you. It's kind of hard to, you see the sheer number of these things. Remember, these are all over the world. But I believe it was, I think you got $1 billion in revenue. Now, California's a big state. A lot of my own client base, when I was at my firm, a lot of clients did $1 billion of revenue in the state of California. But again, that may change. But I think that at least my understanding was that was the baseline. But someone may have heard something more recently.
Mark, you have a question? Mark Winnick?
Yes, I do. Actually, I have a couple of questions, but is this ESG reporting mandatory just for publicly traded companies? And is it going to trickle down to non-publicly traded companies?
Okay, the ESG reporting, the SEC stuff is publicly traded companies.
Okay.
Okay. The one that is important is the one from the EU I put up, the CSRD. That's everybody. Yeah, I think you got like a micro company not to be picked up by it. And again, I'm waiting to see what happens with respect to U.S. companies doing business there. But that doesn't, you don't have to be a publicly traded company in the EU to have to comply with this. But a lot of the other some of the other legislation I think I listed up were broadly applicable though. But the SEC stuff that's gotten the most attention and the most pushback is for publicly traded companies.
So I don't have any publicly traded companies, but if I understand this correctly, let's say one of my clients is a supplier to a publicly traded company. Eventually, that publicly traded company is going to need the information from my client as far as, for example, climate risks, the carbon, what they use in their own, my client's own use of, environmental resources, is which they're going to say, we're not going to give you that number. We're not going to do that kind of research to tell you that number. And then does that mean that client is going to lose the business with that publicly traded company?
Well, when you look at the scope one and two and three emissions,
Yeah.
the scope three were the full value chain. So I've worked with a lot of companies that had received notification from whom they were vendors for, or vendors to, and saying, hey, we want to know all this data about your own emissions. And that was part of their own policy because they voluntarily wanted to actually disclose this stuff. So even if it's not mandated, a lot of companies, larger companies, are requiring this information. I know someone had to tell another company, they wanted to know the car she drove and how far she drove to work and how often she drove, because they were trying to measure her emissions. I mean, and they did it because it was an expectation of their customers.
It's
So,
fair to say too, don't you think, Tim, just based on the way most larger companies work with their vendors, that when they are starting to track something, I just remember this when all of the, I'm going to get it wrong, but all of the management systems were put into place, Six Sigma and the rest of it, that there was an effort from those larger companies to push that down onto their smaller vendors and have them start to adhere to the same compliance standards, to get the same credentialing, etc. It doesn't stop with that larger company just because they're larger. They do look to their vendors to live by many of those same standards.
They do. In particular, for years in the governance space, which we really didn't talk much about here because it's very, very mature, there have been a lot of requirements, for example, FCPA compliance. I'm hiring third-party intermediaries overseas someplace. I'm giving them a bunch of money. I need to know where that money's going. So I was required them to adhere to the same standards of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act our employees had to adhere to. So in the governance space, we've been doing a lot of that. A lot of the due diligence stuff has already been happening. Earlier, I talked about the due diligence required, even though there's no new legal obligations about the due diligence of your supply chain and what have you. So again, and a lot of companies are very forward-looking. It doesn't matter what the politics are. They're going to be very forward-looking. So the expectations on our clients could vary all over the place.
Somebody just posted that in the insurance industry, publicly traded or not, we have to file a climate change survey with California that is public information, and over 30 other states require it as well. I am with a private life insurance company and still have to file it if we are doing business in most states in the country. And Martha, thank you very much for contributing that in the comments section.
Yeah, I focus mostly on the stuff that actually happened very, very recently. But yes, there have been climate risks reporting requirements around for a while, because there are serious financial a potential cost to these kinds of things.
It's 10 o'clock now. I would like to not only thank Tim for joining us today and sharing this information with everyone, but to remind you that Tim was gracious enough, actually before he became chair of the CTCPA board, to start up an ESG special interest group at the society. So we do have that. If you have an interest in ESG and where it's headed, please contact Cindy Paniotto, and Cindy can help you join up for that, or go onto our website. Cindy is the staff liaison for that. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. But Tim, special shout out for everything you did for us with this ESG presentation. Much appreciated.
No, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Have a great day, everyone.